Welcome to the best chess traps in the English opening. This opening starts with white's move pawn to c4, and in this lesson we'll uncover some of the sharpest tricks and tactical traps that can surprise your opponents and give you a quick advantage. Let's dive right in, the first game. In this position, white played knight to c3, and black replied with knight to c6. Then white continued with knight to f3, and black developed with pawn to g6. All of these moves are fairly standard so far. White now strikes in the center with pawn to d4, and black captures. At this point, your opponent will almost always expect you to recapture with the knight, which is the natural move. However, instead of that, you can play a much more aggressive move, knight to d5. At first glance, it may not be clear why this is so strong, but this knight immediately starts targeting some of black's weaknesses, and very soon the point becomes obvious. Black continued with bishop to g7, following the typical King's Indian-style setup. But here white plays bishop to g5, and suddenly the coordination of the knight and bishop creates very unpleasant pressure on black's position. If black tries pawn to f6 to kick the bishop away, it only makes matters worse. After the bishop retreats, it now eyes the c7 square together with the knight, hitting it twice. Black is forced to defend with pawn to d6, but this allows white to simply recapture on d4. Now white has a superior position. Black's king is weakened. The bishop on g7 is blocked by its own pawn and has little scope. Black has multiple weaknesses, while white is ready to jump with the knight to b5 and possibly capture the c7 pawn. Overall, white emerges with a strong and comfortable advantage here. In the actual game, however, Sergei Karjakin did not play pawn to f6, which we just analyzed. Instead, he chose the move knight from g8 to e7. At first glance, this looks like a completely natural and safe developing move. In fact, many players who are unfamiliar with this line play it instinctively. But surprisingly, this move is already a losing mistake. Why? Because white now has a stunning tactical shot available. Knight takes d4. At first sight, it looks like white is simply blundering the knight. After all, black can capture it with either the knight on c6 or the bishop on g7. But in reality, white is completely winning here. Let's break it down. If black ignores the move, white will simply trade off the knight on c6 and then capture the knight on e7, either with the bishop on g5 or with the other knight. This leaves black's position shattered and losing material, so black cannot just pretend nothing happened. If black captures on d4 with the knight, then white immediately plays bishop takes a7, and suddenly the knight on d4 is pinned because the queen on d8 is trapped behind it. This means white wins the black queen outright, so knight recapture is absolutely disastrous for black. If black captures on d4 with the bishop, which is what Karjakin chose, then things look safer for a moment. The bishop seems well placed, and black avoids the immediate queen trap. But this is exactly where white reveals the real point of the tactic. Queen takes d4. Here, white sacrifices the entire queen on purpose. It looks outrageous, but the calculation shows that white is simply winning on the next move, no matter how black responds. The pressure from the knight on d5 and the bishop on g5 is overwhelming, and black has no way to escape. This is the kind of shocking trap that makes the English opening so dangerous. The opponent thinks they are playing logical developing moves, but one tactical slip can end the game instantly. So, what is the point of this trap? First of all, when white plays queen takes d4, the queen is directly attacking black's rook on h8. This means black must respond immediately. If black captures the queen, that seems like a relief. But in reality, it only opens the door for white's final knockout combination. White continues with knight to f6 check, forcing the black king back to f8, and here comes the finishing touch, bishop to h6 checkmate. A clean and beautiful conclusion, finishing the game in style. That wraps up trap number 1. Now let's move on to trap number 2, which occurred in a game between Smitskoy and Brestian, both master-level players. This shows just how dangerous these traps can be. Even strong, experienced opponents can fall victim to them. The game began with pawn to g3, and black developed with bishop to b4. White immediately struck back with knight to d5, putting pressure on the bishop and asking black a tough question. What are you going to do about it? If black does nothing, white will happily capture the bishop. Therefore, black often chooses to exchange knights. After the trade, a problem arises. Black knight c6 under attack. White's knight on f3 is attacking on a5, and if black retreats passively, white can seize the pawn on a 5. So what can black try instead? A seemingly clever idea is pawn to e4, counterattacking the knight. On the surface, this looks strong. Black attacks, white must react, and the center seems to open in black's favor. However, after the exchange of knights and pawns, white unveils the true hidden resource, queen to b3, and suddenly black is in big trouble. The queen threatens both the pawn on b4 and the weak f7 square simultaneously, creating a double attack that black cannot defend. In fact, even though the game has barely started, black is completely lost here. Resignation is the only logical outcome. Another brilliant example of how quickly things can collapse if you're unprepared against the English opening. Notice here that the queen is not only attacking the bishop, but even more importantly, it is indirectly putting pressure on the b7 pawn. That pawn is extremely difficult for black to defend. If the bishop retreats, white will immediately capture on b7 and win additional material. And if black stubbornly tries to keep the bishop on b4, they may delay the inevitable for one move with queen to a7. But after that, white simply pushes pawn to a3, forcing the bishop to retreat anyway, and then white takes the pawn on b7 with ease. In other words, whether immediately or a few moves later, white is guaranteed to win material. The position is hopeless, and it's already time for black to resign. But now, let's ask an important question. What if your opponent tries to use this trap against you? Here's where things get really interesting. The first few moves follow the same pattern, the classical development of the English opening. Then we reach the same position where white plays knight to d5 and exchanges in the center. Previously, we saw that black's counterblow pawn to a4 was a losing mistake. That's true. Normally, you should avoid it. But here, you can actually set up what I like to call a counter trap. Instead of rushing with pawn to a4, black can play knight to d4. At first glance, this looks like a strange move, almost as if black is admitting defeat, giving up the pawn in the center without a fight. But in reality, this is a cunning idea. While it looks passive, the knight on d4 creates tactical possibilities that can quickly turn the tables on white if they are careless. So right at the moment when white thinks they're setting a trap, black flips the script and sets a trap of their own. At first glance, it seems as though black is simply ready to give up the pawn, but the moment white gets greedy and captures it, black strikes back with queen to a7. Now the situation changes dramatically, because white's knight on e5 suddenly has no safe retreat squares. If the knight tries to move away, and it doesn't matter much where, let's say it goes back to d3, black immediately finishes the game with knight to a3 checkmate. The pawn on b2 cannot recapture because it is pinned by the queen, and this ends the game on the spot. Realizing this, white may try another approach by protecting the knight with pawn to f4. But black calmly pushes pawn to d6, and now the knight is forced to retreat anyway. For example, if it goes to d3, black must avoid rushing with knight to f3 check, since then white's king escapes to f2. Instead, black plays the much stronger queen to e4, attacking the rook on h1 and threatening to win it. The rook has only one square to survive, which is rook to g1. But this is exactly what black is waiting for. Now comes the truly shocking move, queen to e3. At first it looks like the queen is hanging to the pawn on f2, but in reality that pawn is pinned and cannot move. The real point is that black is threatening knight to f3 checkmate, and there is absolutely no way for white to stop it. This is a brutal and unforgettable idea. The queen plants itself deep into enemy territory, supported by the knight, and white's position collapses instantly. Either the rook falls or mate is delivered, and white has no choice but to resign. Thanks for watching.